Hola a todos, ¿cómo están? Y sean ustedes muy bienvenidos. Hoy nos acompaña un invitado muy especial, el profesor Brian Trench. Brian fue decano de la Facultad de Comunicaciones en DCU, Dublin City University, y actualmente él es investigador en comunicación científica o divulgación científica, y también él es el presidente de la red internacional de Public Communication of Science and Technology. Honestamente tengo que decir que es un honor para mí que Brian me haya aceptado la invitación para esta entrevista, pues él es el pionero de la divulgación científica acá en Irlanda, y no solamente acá, sino en varios países en Europa y también en las Américas, pues que él ha trabajado con una de las universidades en México, y le vamos a preguntar que nos hable sobre esto más adelante. Hace 2 semanas o 3 semanas, Brian ha lanzado su último libro, que lo ha denominado Little Country, Big Talk. Pues este libro hace alusión a su nombre, pues Irlanda es un país muy pequeño, ¿no? Somos como 5 millones de habitantes. Y Big Talk, pues porque el gobierno irlandés apoya la ciencia, ¿no? Apoya la comunicación científica. Él también ha escrito otros libros. Por ejemplo, tenemos acá Public Communication of Science and Technology. En realidad yo considero este libro como que es una pieza de arte que todos los profesionales o personas que desean dedicarse a la divulgación científica deben tenerlo en su biblioteca. Igualmente, The Public Communication of Science. Este libro son piezas claves, todo divulgador científico debe tenerlo. También me he enterado que el CONCITEC, que es el Consejo Nacional de Ciencia y Tecnología en el Perú, está organizando el primer encuentro de divulgadores científicos, lo cual me pareció una excelente iniciativa y no pude dejar de mencionarlo. Creo que este encuentro se va a realizar, creo que en 2 semanas ya, pero sí es este mes, eso estoy segura. Bueno, yo creo que ustedes se han tenido suficiente escuchándome hablar a mí. Vamos a conversar con Brian ahora. La entrevista la he dividido en 3 partes. La primera parte vamos a preguntarle sobre la historia de la divulgación científica, la comunicación científica y la ciencia en Irlanda desde los inicios y cómo se encuentra actualmente. La segunda parte vamos a pedirle que nos hable de cada uno de estos libros que yo he traído. Y en la parte última vamos a pedirle algunas, digamos, tips o directrices de cómo establecer la comunicación científica en un país que está adoptando por la ciencia, o si ya tiene la comunicación científica, cómo mantenerla y cómo seguir adelante. Pues si algunos países en Sudamérica han decidido adoptar la ciencia y pues seguir el camino de la economía del conocimiento. Brian Trench is a science communication researcher, and he was the head of the School of Communications at DCU, Dublin City University. At the moment, Brian is the president of the International Public Communication of Science and Technology Network, and he has written many books. Some of them are, he is the co-editor with Massimiliano Bucci of this book called Routledge Handbook, Public Communication of Science and Technology, and the Public Communication of Science. About a month ago, he has launched his latest book called Little Country Big Talk. So this book he has written in collaboration with Professor Declan Fahy and Professor Padraig Murphy. Hello Brian, how are you? Thanks for coming.
You're welcome.
Brian, I would like to start asking you about the history of science communication in Ireland and also science, and how what lessons can we learn from the past, and how can we apply? When I say we, I'm talking about South American countries that are now embracing science, that the government is now taking science as a priority. What would you say about that?
Well, let me just go back to the first part of that, the history. I guess there are 2 kinds of history of science communication, and one is a very long history of what used to be called science popularization, and still would be called in Spanish divulgación, or sometimes popularización as well, but usually divulgación. And that has a very long history, and indeed, you know, science doesn't exist without communication. There's never been a time where science had any credible existence except that it was communicated. Now, the communication that has to happen for science to be constituted at all is primarily communication between scientists, through processes of peer review in the first instance, and then through publishing in scientific journals. But actually, if you look even at the early history of what we call sometimes modern science from the 17th century on, there was public communication of science integrated into scientific activity and scientific institutions from very early stages. It was a very limited public. It was the educated upper middle aristocratic classes, male exclusively, but it was nonetheless recognized that there was some responsibility and some value in communicating what was going on in labs, which were very,
and they were
relatively primitive at the time. It was important to communicate what was going on in labs and what it might mean to the wider public.
Exactly, and they were actually going out on the streets, right? I read an article about it, and there's a lot of history that the scientists were actually going to the plazas, to the public, and actually do the experiments there and show to the public how it works and how the results came about. Is that right?
Well, in Ireland, I don't know that there's any history of that particularly, but there were institutions that were established in the 18th century, like what's now the Royal Dublin Society and the Royal Irish Academy, where they would frequently have had public lectures, open doors public lectures done by scientists of the day. I think it's relatively recently, like very much contemporary really, that you find scientists on the streets, at least in the Irish context.
Yes.
So that's the one history then is the long history of science popularization done by scientists and through the scientific institutions to relatively narrow audiences. Now there's another phenomenon, international as well as national, which is naming this activity science communication. And that's the last 20, 30 years. And it's become a priority item in government programs and government policies and political party programs and policies. It's become a priority item in universities, in research institutions, and many other agencies like that within the state and beyond. And that then takes different forms in different places, but also looks quite similar. So, for example, governments throughout the world have started in the last 30, 40 years, and up to now 5 and 10 years ago in some countries, awareness programs to promote awareness of science as part of building an infrastructure for science, also ensuring that the public is supportive or at least aware of what's going on. And that's a different kind of science communication targeted to a much broader audience. And that's really the history that I've been focused on and that I've been active in. So really, when I joined this university where we are now, Dublin City University, in 1992, the term science communication barely existed. And I put the two words science and communication together in organising with some colleagues a conference here in 1993. And so we started that conversation going with scientists, with policymakers, with educators, journalists and others. What's this thing, what might this thing be, communicating science with the broader public? And eventually we established the Masters in Science Communication in 1996. At the same time, the government started its awareness program in this, as it happens, the same year. So it's a very short history of what we might call modern science communication. And it looks quite similar in Ireland to what it looks like in other countries that have gone through a similar kind of process in roughly the same time frame. So there are many Latin American countries that went through a similar process. I mean, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina are the three that spring to mind immediately, where there is a substantial activity and infrastructure of public communication of science by various means, through books, through magazines, through popular journalism, through broadcasting, through science centres and science museums, through science theatre, through science films, etc., etc., etc. All of those things have grown and grown very rapidly over the last 2 or 3 decades in Ireland, as it has also happened in other countries. Now, how do we learn from each other is the question you asked me.
And how maybe, you know, if I give you an example, South American country, Peru, how can Peru harness, you know, this, the history of science communication in Ireland, because I suppose you had falls and ups as well, so how we don't want to make maybe the same mistakes.
Well, it's pretty inevitable that we will, and that you will, or that others will, in a sense that some of the learning is through making mistakes. There isn't. I don't think there's a blueprint. I don't think there's a roadmap or any of those kind of cliche phrases. This is how to do it and avoid all the pitfalls. You know, science communication will become a recognizable phenomenon if there is significant investment. I mean, also not just financial investment, but also moral and intellectual and emotional investment from a wide range of agencies and institutions and organizations and so on. So there's a role for the universities, there's a role for the scientific research institutions, there's a role for the government departments, there's a role for publishers, there's a role for non-governmental and civil society organizations, etc., etc. There's a role for people who specialize in particular areas of biodiversity or
so it's a
seismic
multidisciplinary team that has to work together.
Well, no, I'm just saying that not necessarily a team, because actually that's almost going too far, in a sense that you expect all of these people to kind of get into a room and work together necessarily. Okay. But I'm saying that you can say that you have some kind of infrastructure of science communication. It seems to be that the condition for that to happen is that there is that range or that spectrum of different kinds of actors, as we call it in sociology, that kind of range of actors involved. Okay? No, in other words, it can't just be that the government says, let there be science communication, or that this university over here says, we will do science communication. In the Irish history that I just referred to shows that things were happening simultaneously in different places, out of the same spirit, but not because everybody sat down together and said, here's a coordinated program. We'll have science pages in the newspapers, we will have science programs on television, we will have science programs on radio. These things happened somewhat spontaneously, but the atmosphere, the climate, the zeitgeist, the cultural surroundings of that time, the mid-90s into the 2000s, was supportive towards doing this. To some extent, however, it relates to a considerable extent, it relates to what you mentioned in terms of Peru and other Latin American countries, that if there is a significant increase in the investment in science and scientific activity, then that tends to bring with it some commitment and some support for science communication. Because if it is the policy of the government to give priority to scientific research and to put significant money, as you say, percentage of gross domestic product into it, then as governments, particularly as political actors, they will want to be sure that what they're doing with the taxpayers' money is supported by or acceptable to the taxpayers themselves. So that leads to a certain kind of public communication.
Exactly, that's what I'm seeing now, that the governments actually are investing in science now. Before, 5 years ago, our GDP was below 0.1, if I'm not mistaken. Now 0.7. Well, compared to Ireland, that is 2.4 or 2.5, I think. But
not quite.
Not quite, but almost there. But still, we are in that way. And I feel like the government, especially the CONCETEC, which is the Council of Science and Technology in Peru, is actually working hard and trying to get out Peru, and take it through the war or the path of knowledge economy, which is great. And then I thought, okay, we're doing okay, and then I said, okay, maybe we need to talk to someone like you that has experience in science communication. I believe I'm not quite sure. I'm not living in Peru for more than a decade, so I will know. But I'm going to get in touch with them and talk about if there are specialists in science communication, and that matter.
And those specialists may just emerge over time, but the context that you described there, where the government is trying to increase the percentage of GDP that goes towards scientific research to a respectable level internationally, actually there is another part to that story, which is that governments also, when crisis comes, may decide to reduce the spending, and that's happened in Brazil just in recent months. And interestingly, one effect, one unexpected effect perhaps, of having had a program of activity in science communication is that there are more people that are aware of the reduction of spending than might otherwise have been the case. In other words, if this was all happening more or less within just the narrow context of scientific institutions and universities, whether it goes up or goes down, only a small number of people would care about it. Now more people care. Yeah. So, and in a sense, the fact that March for Science, which was an American initiative to do with American political circumstances, happened on a global scale. Well, it happened very strongly in certain Latin American countries, where they were worried for their own reasons about the investment in science not being maintained or even being reversed, as is happening also in the United States. So there are, from a government point of view, from the point of view of the powers, if you like, there are risks as well as benefits in engaging the broader public with science, because more people now start to care that the investment continues to increase.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's a quite insightful opinion there. Thanks, Brian. I appreciate that. So, Brian, now to the second part of the interview, I want you to tell me about your books. So this is your latest creation, Little Country, Big Talk. Can you please tell our public what is this book about and why do you think it's valuable for them to buy it? Well,
there are probably three levels in which we came at this, myself and my colleagues, Paul Murphy and Declan Fahey. Not in order of priority, but in no particular order. There was a local dimension to this. We started a Master's in Science Communication in this university 20 years ago, and we wanted to mark 20 years of this activity in some way. There was a national dimension. 20 years ago also, the government started a program to raise awareness about science, as I was referring to earlier on, and on the strength of that, other things happened within the society, within the state, that also were tied to that kind of timetable, of time frame of 20 years. And then there's the international dimension, and my activity is both national and international. I'm president of the network PCST, Public Communication of Science and Technology, which is linked with the equivalent network in Latin America, which is called Red Pop.
Okay. I heard about Red Pop.
Popularización de Ciencia y Tecnología. So we have a relationship with them, and so PCST on the global scale is, a mirror, if you like, of Red Pop on the continental scale. And in that international context, there's been a lot of interest in tracking what's happening in different countries over the same time period. How does one country compare with the other? What are the contrasts between countries? What are the different flavors, if you like, of science communication in different cultural contexts? So what we set out to do with Little Country Big Talk, Little Country being Ireland and Big Talk being the ambitions that Ireland has to do important science on an international scale, we try to profile science communication in a single country, looking at the spectrum, and as far as we could, all aspects of science communication, so science events and science centres and science writing and science broadcasting and so on and so on and so on. And we were able to do this by, or we decided to do this by having the contributors drawn from people who had either taught or studied on the Masters in Science Communication here at DCU, because we're the only institution in Ireland that is doing this, and we were one of the first in Europe to be doing this as well. So, if you like, the local and the national and the international came together in putting this book together, which, as far as I know, and nobody's contradicted me yet, as far as I know, this is the first sort of book-length study of science communication in a single country. I have seen many articles and collections of articles about science communication in country X or country Y or country Z, but not a collection that tries to summarize the whole scene, the whole story, from start to finish and in all aspects. Yeah. So that was the ambition.
Yeah, it's actually, I mean, it covered its ambition because I read it and I found out a lot of facts that I myself, am a science communicator, I didn't know about it. And actually, I want to read a nice passage here that really impressed me when it says, and you talk about that already, is that science communications development includes hopeful starts, abrupt endings, and significant absences. You told us about it.
Yeah, that's in a reference to Ireland in particular. So, what I, in the opening chapter, tried to do was to chart things that had got underway at various times over the last 20 years and that are still with us, but also things that started and ended, and some things that started, ended, and restarted, because it's not a linear, incremental path, and that's why I'm very careful not to offer this as a model for any country. There are some learnings, I hope, some lessons, both within Ireland and beyond, from telling this story. But I don't think that there is a model which says you do it like Taiwan, or you do it like Italy,
like
or you
do it like...
you say. So there are, I mean, we've drawn attention in the book to, notable achievements and strengths, but equally to significant weaknesses and absences. For example, just on the weaknesses and absences side, first, media science is very weak in Ireland, particularly print media science. And broadcast media science is also relatively weak because it depends almost entirely on subsidy from the state agency Science Foundation Ireland to happen at all. On the other hand, there are significant achievements and successes, and perhaps the single one that I would choose to highlight is Science Gallery Dublin, which is a new type of science centre, and which is now being replicated or adapted to local circumstances in Italy, in Venice, in London, England, in Bengaluru, in India, and other countries will follow. And it's all out of an idea that was developed, in another university, not this one, in Dublin here, less than just about 10 years ago.
Okay, yeah, they do, they mix art with science, right? As seen at some of the presentations. it's really great and available for all public,
Yeah.
and it's for free, which is great.
It's very open. It's on the street, whereas that particular university is actually doesn't face out to the street very much. That part of the university does face out, and actually Latin America may get its first science center in Guadalajara in Mexico.
Oh, wow.
That's where there's a discussion going on. And,
at the moment?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So we'll probably know about it later on, what happened there. Okay, so I think you mentioned this book already, but I think there are four books of this ones, right? So
yeah.
what
no, I haven't mentioned. This was a request from the publisher, Routledge, which is a well-known international publisher in communications and sociology in particular, but also in other academic fields, to put together a collection of what myself and my colleague Massimiliano Bucchi from Italy considered to be the most important writing about science communication. So it's not the most important writing in science communication, not the most important examples of science communication, but writings about science communication, analyses, reflections, arguments, commentaries, studies, etc. So that's what we did, and the format of 4 books within one collection, if you like, one anthology, is a format that they've used for other subjects. Okay. Without going into the content of it, because that would take too long, but what I think is significant here is that in a relatively short time, when you consider what I was saying about 20 years ago and 30 years ago, which is less than half of my lifetime, public communication of science, or science communication as we usually call it, has achieved sufficient recognition and standing that an international publisher thought it's important now to try and collect together what these editors, myself and Massimiliano, think is the most important work in that field. So it's a sign that the field has matured, and this will have limited audience in terms of the numbers of people who will have it at home, because it's a very expensive item.
It is very expensive. I couldn't buy it myself.
No, it's not intended for individual purchase at all. It's intended for institutional purchase for libraries. So there may be, 5 or 6 universities in the whole of Latin America that will actually have this, and 3 or 4 in
But they do have
Africa.
it in Spain, in Barcelona.
Yeah.
I know they do have it.
Yeah. So that's got a very specific, rather narrowly defined market, if you like, but it has a much wider ambition that for those students working in this area at master's, postgraduate level, or indeed considering doing research in this area, there is a easily used 4-volume set on the shelf which presents the main arguments that have been presented over 50, 60 years in thinking about science communication. So that's what that's about. Yeah.
Well, in my introduction, I said I consider this a piece of art. I mean, it served me a lot during my study. It's a great book. And how about this one? Handbook Public Communication Science and Technology.
Okay, well,
that's an older one, right?
It is. That's the first edition from 2008, and again, we've done with my colleague Massimiliano Bucchi, and the 2 projects connect with each other. They're the same pair of editors, the same publisher, and this work really led to that work, the anthology. But what the handbook format is intended to do is to offer in one book a set of essays and studies on the major aspects of the particular subject, in this case public communication of science. So there's a chapter on science journalism, there's a chapter on science museums, there's a chapter on public attitudes to science, there's a chapter on environmental communication and science communication. There's chapters on risk communication, and so on and so on. So each chapter is written by an expert in the field, and the very satisfying experience that we've had with this was that it was well enough received that we were asked to do a second edition, which we did in 2014, and that has continued to sell right around the world.
That's right.
You know, for a book like that, you're not talking about, you know, every student having a copy, because again it's expensive, but you're hoping that every student who's interested in the subject has access to one through the library. And so
I said that if we are interested, anyone that is interested in science communication, is a must-have book in our bookshelf. We need to have this book. Well, I mentioned as well in my introduction that you are the president of International Public Communication Science and Technology Network, but I think that we're going to leave it for next time, for the next interview, so you can tell us about the public communication science and technology. Okay, so the last part of the interview, I wanted to ask you, you know, in your experience as a science communicator, researcher for extensive long